Amen. So, I think every person in this room has probably had this experience where you went and you saw a movie that left you like on the edge of your seat. One of the movies that I can think of, raise your hand if you've seen the movie Argo. A few of y'all seen the movie Argo? Well, okay, Chase has seen the movie Argo. Any of y'all seen the movie Argo? Anybody? None of y'all have seen Argo? It's such a good movie. Have you seen? Okay, good. We got at least two people in here. Okay. Argo is starring Ben Affleck, directed by Ben Affleck. It was based on the true story that took place during the Iranian hostage situation in which the Iranian people stormed the U.S. Embassy and took all the people hostage. And what happened was there was six embassy workers, 6 or 7, who walked out the back door and were hiding out at the Canadian ambassador's house. And so you got this whole scenario where things just keep getting more and more tense because the Iranians slowly figure out that there's a couple people missing and they're trying to figure out where they are. Meanwhile, the CIA has flown Ben Affleck into Iran to go and to kind of do this covert deal where they're going and trying to get these hostages out of the country using the guys as a commercial, as they're there to film a movie and get them out on commercial airliners. And so as you're watching this movie, as you can probably imagine, things get more and more and more tense, right? Like you're watching it and you're kind of slowly inching forward on your seat, and the movie ends with this scene at an airport and they're trying to get them out on these airplanes. Crazy movie, crazy ending, even though you kind of intellectually know how the movie's supposed to end. For me, seeing it in a theater opening Friday, like you're just mesmerized and captivated, kind of confused and drawn into the story, questioning what's happening, how's this going to end, how are they going to get out of this? But then you watch the end of the movie, everything goes great, they get home, everybody happily ever after, the story's declassified, they make a movie about it. Well, DirecTV gives us every couple of months free movie channels. And so when they do that, I like to go through and see what's on and record, DVR, some of the movies I want to watch later. And one of those was Argo. And a couple months ago, I was riding our elliptical at home, and in our bedroom, I can watch some of the recorded stuff we have on the DirecTV the box. And so I was sitting there and I was like, I'm going to watch the end of Argo because it came on and I recorded it. And so I fast forwarded last 30 or 35 minutes. And I started thinking to myself as I was watching it that there wasn't any of those emotions that I had the first time. Like there wasn't me just going, oh my gosh, how does this movie end? Oh my gosh, how does this work out? Oh my gosh, do they make it out of the country? Why? Because I already knew the ending. Now, it was still entertaining. It was still, fun to watch, but there wasn't that initial, what's going to happen? We're in the thick of it. What could happen in this? Why? Because I'd already seen the end of the story play out. Now, one of the things that I'm constantly reminding us of as we go through the book of Mark, which is what we've been doing, and if you brought your Bibles, you can open them up, Mark chapter 10, verses 32 through 34, Mark 10, 32 through 34. One of the things I'm trying to remind us of as we read the book of Mark is that the participants in the book of Mark, the 12 disciples, like the people following Jesus, they hadn't read Mark yet. Like they hadn't sat down and did a sermon series on Mark. They didn't know how the book ended. They didn't know how the story ended. Jesus was trying to tell them, but they hadn't lived it out yet. Like they didn't know how it was going to finish. And so they're in the thick of it. Like we've got to remember that as we read what we're going to read in these 3 verses, because if we forget that, it's lost on us the confusion that they must have been feeling, the heat of the opposition that they must have been feeling. Because what we're going to see in these 3 verses, and I really was actually not just going to teach on these 3, I was going to teach on a ton more, but then the more I started studying these 3 verses, the more the Lord really spoke to my heart and really my situation and my circumstances through it. And so I just really wanted to share what the Lord was doing in me through this. And so what we're going to see in here is Jesus, for the 3rd time, predicting his death. He's going to predict for the 3rd time what's going to happen to him in Jerusalem. Now, he's already done this in Mark chapter 8, verse 31, and Mark chapter 9, verse 31. So this is the 3rd time he's done it, and I was briefly just going to mention, hey, Jesus is predicting his own death. Look at Jesus. He knows what's going to happen in the future, and then I was going to move on. But the more I pressed into this, the more I started thinking about it from the disciples' perspectives. They didn't know what Jesus was talking about. They thought when he was talking about a resurrection that he was crazy. They thought he was nuts. They were like, what is this dude talking about? Why? Because people just didn't resurrect from the dead. They knew that going to Jerusalem, they were going into the very place that people who opposed Jesus lived and did life. the religious people, the people that eventually murdered Jesus. That's where they were. They were in Jerusalem, and Jesus is intentionally going there. So the disciples, they're sensing opposition, and they're engaging in situations that are confusing. Now, the reason that this is important for us is because we're going to study how their opposition was eventually overcome by Jesus, and their confusion was eventually set straight by Jesus and what he did in Jerusalem. But that doesn't mean that we in this room don't face opposition and don't face confusion. I bet every person in this room has at least engaged a season or a period in their life where they felt like Jesus led them into it, and they've just raised their hand and gone, why are we here? Like, what is going on? Where are you, Jesus? There's been confusing times. And what I'm hoping to do is by looking at the story of Jesus and looking at the story of the disciples that followed Jesus and watching how it all played out for them to give us hope when we're feeling confused, when we're feeling opposed. To give us something to cling on to. Now, my goal is not to answer your question. I don't think that everybody's confusion and the situation you're in right now is just going to be lifted as soon as you hear this message and hear these words. But I believe that we'll have hope that ultimately the confusion will be lifted and the opposition will be overcome. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to read our text, and then I want to address one thing before we get into our points, because we need to be able to trust the Bible. If we can't trust the Bible, why are we even opening it? Like, if we're going to sit here and we're just going to, I don't think Jesus actually said this, or I don't think it means what it says, why are we using it as authority? So I always want to show us why we can trust the Bible, and I'm going to show us that, and then we're going to hit 4 points. So, let me read our text, starting in Mark chapter 10, verses 32 through 34, and then we'll get into it. This is what 32 says. And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise. Now, one of the things that I read in this text, one of the things that I kept engaging as I read the Word of God, like people were talking about it, I was reading commentaries and stuff, what I saw was that there was a good amount of people who would read this text, and what they would think is that this was made up. They would read this and think that somebody made this up. And let me tell you why. Because this prediction of Jesus' death is extremely accurate and extremely detailed. The earlier predictions, Jesus basically said, hey, I'm going to be crucified and I'm going to rise. This one, Jesus gets really detailed into how it's going to happen. Look at what he says. He says he's going to be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes. They're going to condemn him to death. They're going to deliver him to the Gentiles. They're going to mock him. They're going to spit on him. They're going to flog him. And they're going to kill him. All of which took place. We talked about that last week. All of these things took place. Now, the thing that people will push back on, and they'll go, well, you know what probably happened? I bet Mark added this after the fact. I bet Mark said, okay, this is what happened, and so I'll ascribe these words to Jesus to give the book of Mark credibility. And so that's what some people will argue. But let me just point something out that we believe as a church. We've already studied the first 9 chapters of Mark, in which we've seen Jesus teach with authority that no one else had. He cast out demons. He healed the sick, he calmed the storm, and he even raised the dead. I mean, Jesus, the things that he did on every page in the book of Mark are supernatural, miraculous things that continue to point to the fact that he is the Son of God. So if we as a church believe all those things, we believe that he really raised the little girl from the dead, it's not stepping out of his character to be able to predict his death, burial, and resurrection. It makes perfect sense. It keeps with the logic that the book of Mark has, which is why we as a church, and why I will today preach this as truth. He really did say these things. This really did happen. This was a real conversation Jesus had with his disciples before his crucifixion. So, with that in mind, let's hit point number 1, which is this. There will be opposition. There will be opposition. Now, I was watching something this week, and some national news program, and they were talking about a statue that was recently put up in a New York town. And Chase, can we put that picture up? This is the statue from the New York town. Looks like something off of The Walking Dead, right? Now, some of you already know who this is, but if you don't know who this is, like if you haven't been, spoiler alert yet, who does that look like? I mean, does that look like anybody you've seen? Does anybody have a guess? Anybody? That is Lucille Ball. That's supposed to be from I Love Lucy. That was erected in a park in her hometown. That's supposed to be Lucille Ball. And it's funny because if you look on the internet and you Google this, there's people who put up pictures of like their crying baby next to the statue, like it's freaking out their baby. Because that looks nothing like her. Like maybe when you hear it, you go, well, maybe it's the same height. Like it kind of somewhat resembles. Like the whole town's in an uproar. There's even a Facebook page that's like, "We love Lucy, so tear down the statue." Like that's what the Facebook page is entitled. But I saw that picture, that creepy picture that could frighten small children, and I started thinking about the way that we sometimes paint Christianity. Because sometimes we'll paint Christianity as if it's all roses and everything goes wonderful for you. But to paint Christianity without opposition is like saying that that statue looks like Lucille Ball. It doesn't really resemble reality. To say that Christianity doesn't include opposition, that there's going to be days that are hard, that there's going to be days where you feel opposed, maybe physically, spiritually, or relationally, is to paint Christianity in a light that looks like Lucille Ball in that statue. Like it just doesn't resemble the biblical truth. Because the biblical truth shows us that when we give our life to Jesus, yes, eventually we will in Him overcome everything, but that's eventually and not current reality. I'll show you this from Scripture. This is Jesus' words in John 15, verse 20. He says this, "Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you." So the same opposition that Jesus experienced, we can in some way, shape, or form expect to experience. This is 2 Timothy chapter 3. We studied this in our guys' Bible study. This is 2 Timothy chapter 3. It says this, "Indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted." Will be persecuted. Now, I can remember growing up in kind of a Christian bubble. Like I went to a Christian high school, a Christian middle school, just kind of in this Christian bubble. And I would hear verses like this and I would be confused because that wasn't really reality for me in a lot of ways. But the more I've gotten out of that Christian bubble and I've started having conversations and studying the world, I realize that Christians still are opposed. Like that is a current reality that we see. And I don't just mean like overt persecution. I mean sometimes we're opposed spiritually. Sometimes we're opposed relationally, just within our relationships where we're doing life now. Like we still continue to face opposition. And this is something that people have noticed that aren't Christians. That's what shocked me is some of the things that have developed and some of the things that are happening in the world today. There are people who are not Christians. They live a secular lifestyle and they notice that there is opposition to Christianity. I want to read you something. I heard about this week. It was something written in the Wall Street Journal last weekend, and it spoke about the persecutions that are taking place of Christians in the Middle East. Of these killings and things, it said, of these Christian students, that was the Christian students killed in Kenya, 147 of them. Of these Christian students reveals once again the harshest reality of the chaos spreading throughout these regions. The reality is that multiple jihadist armies invoking Islam are engaged in a planned strategy, not merely of territorial aggrandizement, but of extermination. And what that secular author writing for the Wall Street Journal just said is, he said, when I look at the Christians in the Middle East, I see an effort to exterminate them. Like that's what's happening today. Now, first of all, this is such a great reminder that there are Christians gathering around the world this morning that do not have the opportunity to worship Jesus in peace like we do this morning. Like they worship Jesus in fear of their own life. They worship Jesus in fear that somebody's going to bust open the doors, take them all to jail, and potentially cut their heads off. Like that's a reality for someone this morning, and that's something we should be praying about. We should be constantly begging the Lord on behalf of our brothers and sisters to protect them. But it's also a reminder. I mean, it's talking about what happened in Kenya last week where 147 university students were murdered. It's a reminder that we live in a world that is still opposed to Christians. Now, I'm not trying to be doomsdayist. Like, you could take this in a couple different ways, and some of you might have been to the church where, like, they start talking about Christian persecution, and they throw a map on the screen behind you, and it shows, like, persecution coming for America, and then there's an American flag on fire, and the Capitol's on fire, and then people just paint these words. I'm not trying to do that. But what I am trying to give us is a perspective, a biblical perspective, on the fact that as Christians there will be opposition. And maybe that opposition comes in the form of when you're a teenager and you decide you want to live a life that glorifies Jesus and follow Him. There's certain things that you will do that your teenage friends who don't know Jesus don't understand. And there's certain things that you won't do that your teenage friends who don't know Jesus want you to do. And sometimes everybody in this room who's been a teenager, which I think is all of us, sometimes that can be some of the strongest opposition that we could feel. Like being made fun of by our peers, like going a different route than our peers and feeling ostracized by them. That can really hurt. Then there's maybe the coworker who finds out you're a Christian and then all of a sudden, like, who used to work with you now seems to work against you, doesn't want to talk to you, doesn't want to engage you, actually seems to try to harm your work instead of help your work because you're a Christian. Maybe you became a Christian in your family and you're the first Christian in your family. And your family looks at you like you're crazy. They don't want to have anything to do with you. Or they just look at you and go, well, hey, you know what? Like, we don't understand it and we don't really want to engage you anymore because now you're one of them. Like, that could be somebody's current circumstance right now. Or maybe it's just simply holding Christianity in a culture. This culture or any culture, and you see the culture push against you, and you feel that opposition. And what I'm trying to do right now is remind us that that's something that we should expect. Because Jesus right here was walking straight to Jerusalem where they would beat Him and crucify Him. That's what was happening. Jesus didn't avoid it. He went right into it, and He says, hey, there are going to be people who oppose you. There are going to be people who act this way towards you. Now, here's the question, though. It's not an if, but a when. What do we do when this happens? Like what do we do when somebody at work slights us? What do we do when somebody kind of slanders us for no reason? What do we do when we're made fun of by our peers because of what we believe? What are we supposed to do? Well, two things. First, we do not change our beliefs. I believe in that moment what Jesus is doing in us is actually calling us to run to Him. Some people in this room, you faced opposition and confusion from relationships, and in that moment, Jesus drew Himself so close to you and drew you so close to Him that you were experiencing such great spiritual victory even though there was opposition all around you. So in that moment, don't change your beliefs, but run into the one into whom you have believed, which is Jesus. But the second thing I want to remind us of is we don't stop loving and we don't stop serving. We don't stop loving and we don't stop serving. Because here's something else that I've heard. I've heard pastors get up and make a them versus us thing. Where it's like, we're the Christians and they're the world and they're coming against us and we need to go against them. And I look and I'm like, that doesn't make any sense if you truly believe the Bible. And here's the reason that doesn't make any sense. If it wasn't for the grace, love, and mercy of Jesus Christ, you would be them. You would be them. You would be a part of the world. Because every person in this room, at one time in your life, you were not a friend of God. You were an enemy of His. And He showed you grace, and He showed you love, and He showed you mercy, and He showed you service. And what happened is through those things, you gave your heart to Jesus and became a Christian. And what Jesus calls us to do, He calls us to love our enemies, serve our enemies, and pray for our enemies. Now, this doesn't mean we just roll over and not cling to truth, because sometimes the most loving thing we can do is tell people the truth. The most loving thing we can do is tell them, hey, this is who Jesus is and this is who you are, and we're not going to back down off of this. But at the same time, we don't stop praying for them. We don't stop loving them. We don't stop serving them. Because that confuses people who don't know Jesus. They don't know why we would love them selflessly, serve them without expecting anything in return. And in that moment, what they're seeing is the gospel. It is the gospel. And we have an excellent example of this in Jesus. When they were nailing Jesus to that cross, what did Jesus cry out to the Father? He cried out, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And so I want us as a church to be a people who are willing to love and serve even those who would oppose us. Because I believe in that, we could see Jesus do a miraculous thing in bringing them to himself. And the one thing I also want to say before we move on to point number 2, if you read the Gospels, when we're talking about opposition and persecution towards Jesus, it wasn't really the tax collectors or the prostitutes or really even the Romans that seemed to oppose Jesus. It was the religious people. It was the self-righteous, legalistic, religious people that opposed Jesus. They were the ones who ultimately condemned him to death. They were the ones who ultimately arrested Jesus. And so the thing I want us to see in that truth is that sometimes we can expect, if we're really living Christianity out, like if we're really talking about grace and we're really doing life with messy people and we're sharing the gospel with messy people and we're sharing our lives and saying, it's not because I'm an awesome person that Jesus loves me, it's because he's an awesome person, and we're just letting ourselves be on display as broken trophies of grace, there are going to be legalistic religious people who look at that and that offends them, because what we're saying is that we aren't good enough for Jesus, but he saved us and loved us anyway, and we're telling them that the same is true for them. And if you're self-righteous and if you're legalistic, you don't want to hear it. Why? Because you think you are good enough. You think you have earned your way to God. You think you have been good enough. And that's what the religious people thought. Jesus kept telling them, he called them sons of Satan because he wanted them to see how broken they were. And you know what? They didn't want to hear it. They'd rather kill him than receive him. And so if we're really living out Christianity, we shouldn't be surprised if it's the self-righteous, legalistic Christians, use the term loosely, that begin to attack us. And I've seen this in churches. I've been a part of churches where people are meeting Jesus and awesome things are happening, and it was the Christians that attacked the churches, not the non-Christians. And so I want us to keep that in mind as well. And we also continue to love and serve those people as we tell them the truth about their condition and their need for a Savior. Number 2, not only will there be opposition, there will be confusion. Confusion. There were things that I didn't understand completely until I became a parent. So like when I'm a child living in a parent's house, I don't understand some of the things that are happening in my house. Like bedtimes. Why do I need a bedtime? I'm not tired. I'm just going to lay in bed for an hour. Like, why do I need to be put in bed? But what I'm learning is that bedtimes sometimes aren't necessarily just for the kid. It's for the parents. Because we need to go, like there's just a moment where we just got to breathe. And sometimes you can't do that when your house is being burned to the ground. So you need to put the kid in the bed and then you can breathe for a minute. Or when I was a kid, I just didn't understand why we couldn't just buy anything we ever wanted. And now I understand, because money isn't endless. Like, you've got to save for college. Like, you can't just purchase everything. There's a perspective that I have now as a parent that I didn't have when I was a child. And the same is true for us as children of God. We do not have his perspective. Right now, God sees everything. He's not just with us in this church. He's in every church. But not only that, God is outside of time, which means that tomorrow isn't a place that he knows about. Tomorrow is a place that he is currently at, simultaneously with right now. Now don't think about that too hard because your head will explode. But what I'm trying to show us is that we do not have his perspective. And so that means that when we go through things, there's going to be times that we're confused because we don't know what he's doing. Like, we can't see it through his lens. As was true of the disciples. Let me read you verse 32 again. It says this, "And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid." So you've got this picture of Jesus walking to Jerusalem. And the disciples and kind of the rest of the crew are all following Jesus. And they're all amazed. Because they're thinking, hey, Jesus, we're leaving Galilee behind. And Galilee was awesome. Like, we were seeing people come to you, and we were healing people. The ministry was exploding. But you're walking to Jerusalem. That's where the people who don't like you live. That's the headquarters of the religious folk. And they were amazed that he would do that, and they were afraid because they were like, well, if we get there, they're going to kill him, and then they're going to kill us. They didn't understand why in the world he would do that. See, when they mention Jerusalem, we've got to think of it in the same way that we would think of when somebody mentions Washington, D.C. You know, someone talks about D.C., they're like, oh, you're going to our federal government's headquarters, right? Like, all right, oh, we took them to D.C., or oh, that's taking place in D.C. In the same way, Jerusalem for the people in Jesus' day, it was like, oh, they're going to Jerusalem. That's where the scribes and the Pharisees were. So that's why they were amazed and afraid. And so we see how that played out for them. But I don't want us to forget that we still walk in amazement and we still walk in fear. We still are confused at times when God leads us to a certain place. See, I used to naively think that the only time I would be confused and the only time I would look up at God and go, God, what's happening, was when I myself led myself into sin. And that happens. Like, we've all gone astray and we've all done stuff that we look at and we go, okay, I got myself into this situation. This is a bad deal. But no one ever told me that if I followed Jesus like the disciples did, there was going to be times in following him that I looked around and I went, God, what's happening here? Where are you? What is going on? Why can't I see you right now? But right now, we see an example of the disciples following Jesus. They're in step with him, and they were still confused. One of the times I can remember being the most confused was when I graduated college, moved back to Memphis, and started going to seminary. And all of a sudden, everything changed for me. I'm trying to figure out how to be a husband. That's not easy. Like, I feel like I'm failing at that. I've left behind all these friends that I had at school. I came back to Memphis to start a church. I don't know how that's going to even take place. And I'm trying to figure out what to do in seminary. And I don't really know how to engage that culture yet. And I'm looking around and I'm going, God, like, I feel like you led me here, but where are you? As your pastor, I can be honest and say there's been times as the pastor of this church I felt the same way. One of the reasons I was so excited to announce the potential move that we have is that there have been so many potential moves that have fallen through. Like, we've probably spent the last year and a half, 2 years looking for space that would work for us. And every single time, something happened where it wouldn't work. We couldn't afford it. Somebody else got it. You know, it didn't work for this reason. It didn't work for that reason. And at some point, I'm just like, God, where are you in this? Like, we want to have a place that we can do life in and do church in, and we want to grow. And God, can you give us this? And sometimes I'm just like, where are you? And you can be honest and say you've been there too. Because that's what happens sometimes when we follow Jesus. But just because we don't understand doesn't mean that God is not doing something in our confusing situation. Which brings me to number 3. Jesus is never surprised. Jesus is never surprised. Even though we might be opposed and we might not know what's going on, Jesus is never surprised. Anybody can have their day ruined by a bad surprise, right? Last Saturday, a week ago from yesterday, I went and bought new running shoes. I do that about every 6 months. And I love new running shoes because I love to run. And so when you get new running shoes, it just feels like you got springs on your feet. And so I was excited about getting a new pair of running shoes. And so Tuesday, I went running in them for the first time. Such a great run. Like, I just had, I was listening to music and I was running and it just felt so good. And then afterwards I went to the gym and had a great workout. Well, when I left the gym, I went to my in-laws' house because I had to pick something up. Well, my in-laws, they were getting new floors. And so they had all the floors ripped up and they were starting to lay new floors. And I just wanted to look at them. And so I walked from their kitchen and I walked into their living room area. So I'm just looking at it and looking at it and the guys are working. And all of a sudden with my right foot, I just go right into fresh glue with my brand new shoe. And all the guys look up as soon as they hear it and they go, oh no, you just stepped in glue. And I was like, oh, I did just, it was like gum times 1,000. And so I'm just looking at it and they're like, I'm apologizing to them. I'm like, I'm so sorry I messed up your workspace. And they're like, no, man, those shoes look new. I'm sorry for you. And so I'm sitting there for like 20 minutes trying to scrub the glue off. And in that moment, that great run and that great workout took a back seat to that really bad surprise when I stepped on glue. And so we've all had that happen. Where we had a great day, everything was great, sun was out, birds were singing, it's spring, woo! And then we got a phone call. We got an offender bender. Something happened. The doctor's office called. The bank called. Your kid called. And all of a sudden your great day went down the toilet with a bad surprise. But here's the thing. Jesus has never had that happen. Jesus has never had a moment where he goes, ooh, I didn't see that one coming. How do we know that? Look at verses 33 and 34. Jesus says, see, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise. What does this show us? This shows us that Jesus' crucifixion was not a surprise to him. We can read the story of his crucifixion and resurrection, and sometimes we can in our minds think, oh, poor Jesus in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Jesus was going to Jerusalem on purpose to have this happen to him. It didn't catch him by surprise, which means that your opposition and your confusing time, he's not surprised by. In fact, he used this opposition and this confusing situation, redeemed it, and is saving people all around the world to this day through it. That gives us hope, right? Like that gives you hope in the midst of your confusion, in my confusion. Here's an example. This is a biblical example of Jesus doing the same thing through the church. In Acts chapter 1, verse 8, the second half of it, this is where Jesus is about to ascend into heaven. And the book of Acts is all about the growth of the church. And so Jesus is about to ascend into heaven, and he's having a conversation with the early church, a couple dozen people, and he says this, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. That's what Jesus says. He says, you know what? You're going to start here in Jerusalem, you're going to go to Judea and Samaria, and you're going to go to the ends of the earth with this message. And they're like, okay. They don't know how that's going to happen, but soon they would find out. Because in Acts chapter 7, Acts chapter 1 through Acts chapter 6, church explodes in Jerusalem. Explodes. Thousands of people come to know Jesus. Everything's great. But then persecution breaks out. Opposition breaks out in Acts chapter 7. And the religious people, they kill a guy named Stephen. Well, this persecution results in something. And this is Acts chapter 8, verse 1. It says this, and there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem. And look what happens. Because of the persecution. And they, the Christians, were all scattered throughout the regions of where? Judea and Samaria, except for the apostles. And what happened as they went? Look down at verse 4. Now those who were scattered went about preaching the word. So what happened? Persecution, opposition, confusing situation happens for the church. And what does Jesus do with that? He uses it to tell the world about himself. He scatters the people and they go to Judea and Samaria, the very places he'd said they'd go. And they tell people about Jesus, and people continue to meet Jesus to this day. Church, that's good news. Because that means in our confusing, opposing circumstances that God can and is using those to advance his glory and for our good. Let me tell you another example. This is a personal example. One of the things that I'm always encouraging our church to do, and I want to do myself, is be inviting people. And so there's a group of people that I usually text almost weekly. And a couple weeks ago, this is just kind of a specific situation, but a couple weeks ago, I texted this particular person, and I said, hey, I'd love for you to come to church this Sunday. I know you've got an open Sunday. I'd love for you to come. And this person texted me back. I loved it. Because she goes, thanks for thinking of me. She was so gracious, but she goes, I'm going to continue my avoidance of organized religion. And I laughed because I was like, that's the first time anyone has ever called our church organized. I was like, thank you. And I texted her back. I was like, that's the first time anybody's called our church that. I'll see you soon. And it didn't bother me at all. But over time, all of those frustrating circumstances where I'm constantly inviting people and people are like, yeah, I'll see you in the morning. They don't show up. Like all of that, it can get frustrating. But you know what I've seen God do in my heart? There's people that I'll invite and I'll be like, hey, I'd love for you to come. Well, I'll see them like on Monday or Tuesday. And they'll be like, how did church go? You know what they get to hear? The sermon. I'll sit down for 15 or 20 minutes. Well, guess what we talked about? Some of you are like, you can do this in 15 or 20 minutes. That's not the point. What I do is I sit there and I'm like, hey, we talked about Jesus and this is true. You can go through opposition and there can be confusion. But and I'm sitting there like talking to him and I'm telling him all about Jesus. And what I've seen God do in that is he's grown relationships with people who've never stepped in these doors, but I'm getting to share the gospel with. And it's up to him what happens from there then on out. I can't save them, but I can sure tell them about Jesus. And so some of you, maybe you've been inviting people and they won't show up. What an opportunity to say, hey, guess what we talked about last week? And maybe just share one thing you learned from the sermon. You don't have to sit there for 20 minutes, but just say, hey, I really found hope in this confusing situation because I know that Jesus is working in it. Because see, we serve a God, according to Romans chapter 8, verse 28, who works all things out for the good of those who love him. Who works all things together for the good of those who love him. That's so encouraging. And some of you are like, I don't see it now. You might not see it this side of eternity. I don't have the answer. And sometimes I think some of the greatest danger we can do as a church is try to come to people who are going through difficult circumstances and give them an answer. Well, this is why this is happening. No, just be quiet, hug them, weep with them. We don't have all the answers. We just have hope. Why? Because there was a guy named Jesus walking into the beehive that was Jerusalem to be murdered brutally. And he turned that brutal murder into the salvation offer for the whole world. And that's the God we serve, which means I know he can take whatever we're going through and do the same thing with it. Finally, number 4, ultimate prosperity. Ultimate prosperity. One of the things that I hope in messages like this to get across is that I'm not a prosperity guy. And what I mean by that is I do believe Jesus blesses. I do believe Jesus gives us great gifts. I do believe there's things, good things that happen to us from following Jesus that would not have happened otherwise. But I don't believe being a Christian means that you'll never get sick, you'll never get hurt, your relationships will always be perfect, everything will be great. And here's the reason why. Nobody's ever experienced that. Like, any Christian who has a birthday that is over 125 years from today hasn't experienced prosperity by that definition because they did get sick and they died. So that doesn't logically make sense. I do believe in an ultimate prosperity, however. And let me kind of explain it like this. I guess it was a couple years ago, I'd borrowed a friend's pressure washer. And I was pressure washing somebody's house. And I was using their pressure washer and everything was going great. Y'all know pressure washer, it's like a thing you hook the hose up to, shoots the water out real fast, and you can kind of clean dirty stuff without having to scrub. You just spray the pressure washer. Well, after about an hour of using the pressure washer, I heard, clink, and then all the pressurized water just stopped coming out, and it just kind of, I'm like, well, I can't do anything with this. And so I turned it off and turned it back on and did what I knew to do, which was kick it a couple times, and that didn't fix it. And so I called the owner, and I was like, John, I am so sorry, but I think I broke your pressure washer. And I was like, man, I'm going to have to pay for this. I feel so bad about it. And he goes, hey, man, don't worry about it. It was either going to happen to you or it was going to happen to me next time I used it. He was so gracious, but I started thinking about that pressure washer was going to break regardless of whose hands it was being used in. And listen, the same is true for us in this room. Whether you place yourself in the hands of Jesus Christ or not, there's still going to be brokenness in your life. But see, the reason we Christians have hope isn't because of some sort of false thing where we say, nothing bad is ever going to happen. But it's because we serve a God who came into the darkness that is this sinful world, experienced everything that we experience, experienced the worst of it all. Listen, we threw at Jesus the worst that we had to offer, which was death on a cross. And he overcame it. And what happens is, by him overcoming it, by his resurrection, by that victory, we have hope that one day there will be an ultimate prosperity, where there will be no more confusion, where there will be no more opposition, where there will be no more death, where there will be no more sickness, where there's not going to be any more tears. We're not going to need to cry, because Jesus one day is going to split the sky open and come back and fix everything, and we're going to get to walk in ultimate prosperity. That is awesome, and that gives us hope even in the midst of our darkest days. Because Jesus didn't stay in the tomb. Because Jesus walked out of the tomb. We know that one day we as well will have ultimate victory. And I love that because what we see here as we talk about Jesus' suffering is the very vehicle that he brings us out of suffering through. Like he takes his suffering, he pays our penalty on the cross, he resurrects from the grave, and he says, you know what? You know what death is now? Death just becomes the means by which Jesus brings us into his presence. Oh, death, where is your sting? He took away the sting on the cross. That's such good news for every person in this room, regardless of how you see yourself this morning. Regardless of if the storm clouds are there, it's a sunny day. Because here's what I know. If it's a sunny day, one day the storm clouds will be there. And in that moment, in your darkest moment, you can still have hope because Jesus overcame the darkest moment of the human history when humanity murdered him. He overcame it with victory in the resurrection. Now, here's the thing I want to end on because we're about to take communion. There was something in this text that really stood out to me that I wanted to save for last because we see Jesus purposely going to the cross. Like he didn't just happen upon the cross and he caught in an alleyway at the wrong place at the wrong time. The reason he was crucified was because he let them crucify him. We could talk all day about biblical evidence that shows us that's true. But there's a picture in this text that I want to paint for us and then we'll conclude. It's found in verse 32. Let me read it again. This is Mark chapter 10, verse 32, and it says, and they were on the road going up to Jerusalem. They're all on their way to Jerusalem. And it says, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. Now, me, if I'm going to my known crucifixion, I'm probably going to have to be dragged there. But not Jesus. Jesus is 5 steps ahead of everybody else in the group, walking steadfastly towards Jerusalem. But the question is why? Why would he do that? Why would he, knowing what was going to happen to him, why would he place himself in that situation and allow for that to happen when he could have stopped it at any moment? Because as John 3:16 says, for God so loved the world. He loved us. It was love that drove him to Jerusalem. It was you. It was me. He didn't do it because he, pulled the short straw with God the Father and God the Holy Spirit. Oh man, I got to go do this for him. He did it because he loves us. His broken body, his shed blood, his crucifixion, beaten, bloodied beyond recognition. He did it because he loves us. He did it because he wanted us. He did it because he cared about us. And so what we get to do this morning on this, after we've studied this text where we see Jesus talking about what's going to happen to him, where he's beaten, where he's turned over to the authorities, where he's mocked, where they put a crown of thorns on his head, and where they whipped him, where they crucified him, and where he resurrected, what I want us to do is I want us to take communion. It's an excellent reminder of his shed blood and broken body that were broken for us. Not in some big picture world type way. If you're in this room and you know Jesus and your sins have been forgiven and you're walking in new life, he did this for you. Like this is applied to you. That's so encouraging, even in our darkest days. And what this is a reminder of for those of us in this room who are experiencing opposition, who are experiencing confusion, is that we can look at the story that the disciples went through and see that one day that opposition and that confusion, he's going to overcome it all because he overcame it because that broken body and that shed blood walked out of that tomb 3 days later. And that's such good news for us. And maybe this morning what this will serve for you is just a reminder of the love of God. That he would steadfastly lead the charge into the place where he would be crucified. That he loves you that much. So what